First of all, everyone in here knows more about how growth has affected you than I do. You have to live with it here on a day-to-day basis. The other thing is, you cared enough to come out tonight to help participate in this conversation, the beginning of this conversation, to figure out how do we deal with these growth challenges? How do we protect those things that we really love about our community? What things are we trying to preserve? What things do we want to change? And you're to be commended for that. And I say that with all humility in that I have worked in a lot of different places. But you are the experts here tonight, and we hope to hear from you as we get further into the conversation. What I'm going to do is really talk about three questions. How do we know what we need to know? How do we know what we should be doing? Carson has spent some time talking about that and talked about it from the fiscal side. I'll go into it from a little bit different perspective. What's in our toolbox? Some of these tools will be easier to implement than others, so it will require some legislation. But these are some tools that have been used throughout the country, sometimes to good effect, sometimes not. I'll talk about that as well. And then the real focus is which of these tools are best at addressing the timing and cost of growth. And that's the question, the fundamental question I was asked to speak to. Very often I go into communities and people will say, boy, this community was great until I moved in here and it's gone downhill ever since. Never putting two and two together that maybe they had something to do with that. Well, the reality is when we move into a community, we have a level of service, we have some expectations, but that changes, particularly when we have such a desirable place to live. This picture, by the way, is from Austin. I cut my planting teeth in the city of Austin, in that area, and they had this approach in the 80s that if we don't build it, they won't come. That didn't work. They weren't prepared for what was coming. Now, they don't enjoy as much public land as you have here. They had a lot more private land that they had perceived as being open space. And so that was part of the problem. But the reality was they denied the inevitable that was coming to them, that they have a very desirable environment, as you do, and people want to move here. And that's going to create some changes. So how we deal with it is up to us. Compass is about to launch a process that I hope all of you will stay abreast of and participate in. It's called a scenarios analysis. It's really asking the question, where should we grow? How should we grow? How should we pay for it? And the way that process works is that there will be some growth scenarios that are developed where we take our presumed growth and we figure out, where does that fit? How does that fit into our future? How would we like to see that occur within the Treasure Valley? And then our work comes in figuring out what are the relative impacts. And that's where Tyson's work steps in a big way to look at what are the fiscal impacts of that. But also, many other people will be involved in the process to figure out, what does that mean for traffic congestion? What does it mean for schools? What does it mean for emergency services? What does it mean for the character of our community? And this is a little snippet I took. I've been fortunate that the city of Durango, Colorado have hired me now 4 times to go through the scenarios process with them. And it's been great to do that because we went through it the first 3 times and got fairly similar results, that if they had a more compact development pattern, their transportation system would function better. And this is very useful because for those people who wanted to push everybody outside the community, they realized, oh, if everybody lives outside the community and all the jobs are still inside the community, our traffic problems get much worse. There's no way we can deal with them. And what was interesting is just a couple of years ago, I went back and redid this, and we took the growth that they've had and looked at their scenarios, and they found, oh, now we can accommodate some external growth, and the numbers will be better because they had reached a critical point for infill that they really couldn't accommodate significant additional infill. Now, the point of I'm sharing all of this is that that scenarios process must be a credible process as you're going through it. It needs credible fiscal analysis as part of that, credible service analysis. But there's one other thing it needs that nobody, that nobody can provide better than you can, and that is the introduction of values. What do we value? I don't know that Carson mentioned it just now, but while we're looking at fiscal analysis, a lot of our decisions are not just fiscal. They're about character, they're about open spaces, they're about things in our neighborhood that we love, our schools. They're about protecting those things that we love. And so that has to be part of the analysis too. I'm going to use the term growth management. Carson has used it, and I think he already said this, but I'm going to reiterate it, and that is growth management is neither pro-growth nor anti-growth. In fact, it may be both, depending on where you are in the community or what type of development is proposed. Growth management is just saying, we're expecting changes. What is the way that we can help manage those changes so they lead to the best community? Carson has talked about some of the fiscal tools. I'll mention one of them in passing in just a bit, but most of your regulations that address development, or your land development regulations, focus on where growth can occur, how intense it is, what's the density that's allowed there, what mix of uses do we have in that area, who's going to provide the infrastructure, what infrastructure is needed, and how does it get paid for? Those are critical items, all parts of your code. More and more communities are paying closer attention to design, and from the little bit that I've driven around since last year, which has been a little over a decade, you're paying much more attention to design and the character. The critical part of this is that when we talk about the capital facilities, I want to emphasize that design is often important to make sure that they work. If you have transit, but you can't get to it, that transit, nobody's going to use that transit. So most of what I want to talk about is timing. And a couple of comments. We mentioned impact fees. Impact fees are just one-time charges for the proportionate share of capital costs. We'll talk a little bit about growth caps and then also focus on public facilities. As I said, the impact fees is a one-time charge. It's only the fair share or the proportional share of those capital costs, and just capital costs, not operating costs. The problem is, very often we think, oh, we have impact fees, growth is paying for itself. Well, the impact fees actually lag. By the time you've collected enough impact fees to pay for a facility, very often that facility has been in demand for quite some time. So your level of service has dropped. They only fund the proportionate share of development. That's important because they don't cover existing deficiencies, they don't cover external demands from other jurisdictions, and they don't cover operations and maintenance. So what do we do about growth? Some communities, in fact, there are estimated over 1,700 communities, have said, let's put a cap on the rate of growth. I think it was around 1970 that the city of Boulder did that. They said, we're not going to grow faster than 2%. Well, Boulder has the most expensive housing in the region. It also only worked because Boulder convinced the county not to approve any development around them. They weren't the only game in town, or they were the only game in town. So they could do that to some extent. But they've also found there is no affordable housing, therefore they have to subsidize housing. They have to subsidize groceries. They have to subsidize health care. They have to pay for some of the economic impacts that they didn't really expect to have. So those unintended economic impacts are critical, particularly for restaurant owners who they have to bus people in from out of town to work in their restaurants because nobody can afford to live and work in their restaurants. So another one that I think has greater effect, I think growth limits are difficult here because we have so many different jurisdictions. You squeeze that balloon and the development will go elsewhere, and that won't necessarily solve your problems. Adequate public facilities, though, really do measure whether we have adequate capacity at the time development is created. And to implement those, we have to balance several things. How much capacity do we have? How much demand do we have? Hopefully demand does not exceed capacity. What's our level of service? How long do you want to wait at an intersection? How many temporary buildings do you want to have at a school? How long do you want to wait for the ambulance or the fire truck to get to your house? That's our level of service. And then that's all bolstered by a capital improvement plan, because local governments have to make a good faith effort to solve some of those problems, to meet those existing deficiencies. If they don't, none of this is defensible. There are a lot of considerations to take in mind when going through the process of developing adequate public facilities ordinances. I'm not going to go into these in great detail. I'm going to focus on a couple of these factors that I think are important. First of all, what happens if we don't have adequate facilities in place? Well, you have some choices. You can wait. Development waits until there is capacity, until the capital improvements plan provides that capacity. You can reduce demands either by phasing developments or reducing density, or taking another approach. One approach that's increasingly common is pay and go. This is something that's used in Florida, the concurrency program, that if the applicant wants that development to go before the facilities are in place, they can pay the capital costs of those facilities and then proceed with development. And the fourth one is to reach that public-private partnership, a development agreement. Adequate public facilities requirements are not a panacea. There are lots of ways to do them wrong. In the 35 years that Florida has been doing them, and the 30 years that Washington State has been doing them, they've solved a lot of the problems. They've fixed a lot of problems. Not all of them, but at least we can see anticipate what those problems are going to be. One of the problems is failing to address the deficiency. One of the things that's become increasingly clear is you can't build your way out of congestion. Traffic is like a fluid. The more capacity you open up, the more traffic moves into it. So there's an induction factor that you induce traffic by providing excess capacity. This interchange that you see on the lower right was overcapacity the day it opened. And I have to say, it was maybe 3 weeks ago, I was down in Doral. Coming home, I waited, I had dinner, and so it was 7 o'clock before I headed home. It still took me nearly an hour to get through this area. It was bumper to bumper. The other one is we don't necessarily always want to provide that capacity. If you look at that picture on the top right, I think I can still sprint across there and make it. I don't think I can get my mother across there. And I darn sure would want to live anywhere near where I had to cross that road. That isn't the character I'd want to see. So sometimes we can build things that aren't necessarily what we want to have long term. And if you look at the picture on the lower left, this used to be a double-decker highway. This is by the Embarcadero in San Francisco. When the earthquake knocked down the double-decker highway, or the elevated highway, they said, let's not build it. Let's take another approach and create a better place. The final thing on the list is that if you think about it, where do we have the most capacity? Out in the middle of nowhere. The farther I get from utilities, the farther I get from employment, the farther I get from other houses, the more road capacity I have. Bingo! I can go through this adequate public facilities test. But if I'm downtown, oh, it's already congested, there's no capacity, I can't do anything. So what we've had to do in the field of working with adequate public facilities is figuring out how to adjust those levels of service so they work. And figuring out how to, in some cases, waive them to say we'd rather have congestion. Downtown Orlando is doing wonderfully now. But that's because they've decided we don't care if it's a parking lot for an hour a day or 2 hours a day, because we want walkable streets, very livable downtown. Just some closing thoughts. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. 1 minute. Okay, I can wrap this up in 1 minute. This will never work unless you stay with us, that you help champion this, that you support your leaders, your decision makers, as they go through the process to bring all of the jurisdictions to the table. Because this doesn't work if only one jurisdiction does it. It has to involve regional coordination on it. We have to address the capital and the funding side. We have to make sure that the stakeholders understand what the potential implications are, so we know how to address them. If we're going to do something that's going to jack up housing prices, how are we going to address affordable housing or workforce housing? We've got to be able to go through this process to get it right the first time, and I guarantee when you do it right the first time, you're still going to need to make some adjustments. So long term, you need to stay with that process. And with that, I want to thank you again for coming out tonight, because you're going to help solve the problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.